a little earlier. So Botswana poll is being considered the most closely contested poll since independence, 1966. Opposition parties are already doubting if a fair result can be delivered, speaking about scenarios of intimidation that have been playing out in some parts of the country. So the question is, what kind of scenarios might play out? To discuss this, I'm now joined on the line from Pretoria by the Director of Political Economy, Southern Africa, PESA, Sia Biniza. Sia, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. So Botswana, they go to the polls, but for the first time, we're not 100% certain who's going to win. How has it come to this?
Sure. So you might remember that in the last elections in 2014, the ruling party, BDP, lost 8 seats in the parliament. And these were mainly gained by the opposing UDC, which increased its sort of position from 6 seats in 2009 to 17. And so the BDP has progressively been losing some support, but the most recent tensions have resolved around the fallout between former President Seretse Khama and the current President Masisi over issues around reversal of policies that were previously passed by former President Seretse Khama, such as controls and the high taxes on alcohol, and so this has resulted in a fallout, and former President Seretse Khama has gone over to support the opposing UDC instead of his party, the BDP. And so if we see a repeat of 2014, it's likely that the BDP might lose more support and that the UDC might increase its support, resulting in a need for there to be a sort of a coalition government, so to speak. However, the Botswana electoral system is a first past the ballot system, and the parliament won't be forced to create a coalition government. However, the tensions, given the certain losses in the regions, etc., will definitely slow things down in terms of policies and reforms going forward as a result of the highly contested elections that we're faced with.
How credible do you know, if you have an idea, are the claims of intimidation and that the opposition have some serious concerns? Is it something that really should be taken note of?
Sure, but I think the sort of outcry we've seen generally is a typical outcry of opposition parties in the region, rather. But, the elections aren't always going to be perfect, but Botswana is amongst the most politically stable countries in the region, and they do have quite strong institutions and rule of law. And so, in spite of them not being able to execute a 100% flawless election, I think the IEC is well prepared for this election. Also, given the relative size of the election, you're only talking over 900,000 registered voters in the full population of 2.2 million people. And so this is very manageable in relative comparison to other elections in the region.
All right. So as the media, sometimes we get caught up, of course, in following some of these juicier stories, this spat between Khama and Masisi. What are the bread and butter issues that the ordinary Botswana are going to vote for or against?
Sure. So the major issues are around certain transparencies on major reforms, around spending on education particularly, which has been highlighted as an area of concern historically, given the involvement of current President Masisi in some illicit deals in the sector. And in addition to this is general reforms around diversifying the economy. You'll remember that for a long time now, Botswana has been criticized for being very dependent on diamond exports and beef exports. And so really what we're faced with now is a handing over, so to speak, from a country that has been mainly led by successive leadership that has maintained stability into an era now that requires much more concerted reform and implementation of policy. So those are really the critical issues that Botswana will be mostly concerned about.
All right. Sia, I just wonder if we could spend a couple of minutes talking about the president's trip to Russia. 40 leaders from across the continent have gone to Sochi. And the big question is, why?
Sure. So a lot of people are wondering why is Russia sort of looking to re-engage on the continent and establishing or at least reigniting former Soviet Union ties throughout the continent. And the reason why Russia is doing this, I think, obviously, is because it's falling behind in terms of its partners in the BRICS. If you think of the quite extensive involvement and investment by the Chinese government, but also the investment by the Indian government on the continent. And then again, if you look at its adversaries, who have already established even military installations throughout the continent, if you think of the U.S. with its military installations in Djibouti, in Kenya, and some parts of West Africa, this is now also becoming not just a contestation about who's going to take advantage of the economic opportunity presented by the continent, but also around participation on security issues. And obviously, globally speaking, the major issue is that you've heard the speculation about the coming sort of global recession that's supposedly worse than 2008. And that means that the traditional export markets, such as the European Union and the U.S., will no longer be available. And so with the passing of the recent passing of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, now the African continent presents itself as an opportunity given the unification of the market through that agreement. And so this is literally, I think, the Russian government sort of playing its preemptive role to try and position itself on the continent, but also trying to play catch up with some of its partners and adversaries who are already quite involved in terms of their international development or foreign affairs policy on the continent.
All right, so Russia's been a friend of Africa for many years, particularly during the struggles for liberation, providing arms and military training. What's been in it for Africa since then? They're meeting in Sochi. What's in it for Africa in this relationship?
So it seems very little. Unlike the Chinese involvement, and I think the Chinese involvement is slightly different than what we've had with the European Union and the U.S. historically, in that the Chinese investments are visible, they're public, and so every sort of citizen has got access to them compared to the historic investments that were mainly done through foreign direct investments that either typically benefited the middle class, etc. Russia, however, is quite unique in that its involvement has been mainly in terms of arms. And this has been, both positive and negative in that it created some instability in some areas, whilst in some areas, such as its involvement in the Central African Republic, has really tried to stabilize some of the rising political or security tensions in the region. What's in it for African countries is very little. Currently, Russia trades about $5 billion worth in terms of exports to Africa, and they're looking to double that in the next 5 years. However, it's not clear how much exports outside of raw mineral commodities, of course, go to Russia as a benefit for African countries. But typically, you've seen that, post-Cold War period, Russia's continued involvement in sort of trading arms for access to mining licenses, etc. And this has been its involvement, which is slightly different from the traditional foreign direct investment or infrastructure investment that China has been leading on the continent.
And I would imagine also for President Ramaphosa to be seen sitting at these tables, surrounded by African leaders, sort of helps shape his agenda, taking over the AU in the coming year.
Definitely, and obviously, given the prestigious position that South Africa has with these are sort of continental/bilateral type of relations. If you think of the FOCAC Forum of China with the continent, or the recent established Russian forum with the continent. However, South Africa is sort of an insider, given that we are parties to the BRICS, which is trying to challenge the hegemony of the sort of Bretton Woods institutions such as the World Bank and IMF. And so South Africa does have a sort of elevated position in these types of arrangements and has much more of a voice than the rest of the partners on the continent.
All right, Sia Beniza, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for joining us and giving us your insights. Sia Beniza is the director of the Political Economy Southern Africa, an organization, think tank known as PESA. All right.